20 years ago, her brother Jack had written home from Iraq about a Marine who dragged him out of an ambush near Fallujah. A man who ignored enemy fire, who carried him to safety even when Jack begged him to leave him behind. If not for him, Jack had written, I wouldn't be here. And now that man stood in front of her, worn down, hollow-cheeked, his hands chained like a criminal. The charges were small time. Loitering behind some cafe, refusing to move when the cops told him to. The prosecutor, a slick kid in a suit that cost more than Elias probably made in a year, laid it out like it mattered. Third offense this year, Your Honor. We're recommending 30 days community service and a no trespass order for downtown. Elias didn't react. He just stood there, like he'd stood through 100 briefings, 100 orders. But Olivia saw the flicker in his eyes when the prosecutor said, no trespass order. That would ban him from the shelter on 4th Street, from the church meals, from the only places that kept him alive when winter came. Mr. Carter, Olivia said, keeping her voice steady. Do you have a lawyer? He shook his head. His public defender had been pulled into another case. Would you like to speak for yourself? She asked. Elias cleared his throat. No excuses, ma'am. Just needed to stay warm. Why that spot? She pressed, sharper than she meant to. Jimmy, the cook, leaves food sometimes. Knew his daddy. Served with me in Desert Storm. A beat of silence. Then Olivia did something she never did. She broke procedure. And your service? Elias straightened a little, like some old instinct kicked in. United States Marine Corps, 1975 to 95. Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Iraq. The words hung in the air, heavy with things unsaid. Olivia's pen hovered over the file. Before she could speak, the courtroom door swung open. A man in a navy suit walked in like he owned the place, setting a briefcase on the defense table. Your Honor, Alexander Ross, apologies for the interruption. I've just been retained to represent Mr. Carter. Elias turned, confused. I didn't call no lawyer. Ross leaned in, voice low. You don't need to. This one's on the house. Olivia studied them both, her face unreadable. But her hands under the bench weren't as steady as her voice when she said, Court's in recess, 15 minutes. And just before she stepped down, she looked at Elias, really looked at him, for the first time. Mr. Carter, she said quietly, when we come back, we're going to talk about more than just this case. Then she walked out, leaving the room buzzing behind her. The judge's chambers smelled like old books and coffee left too long in the pot. Olivia Parker shut the door behind her and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her hands shook as she pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk. The photograph was right where she kept it. Her brother Jack in his dress blues, arms slung around her shoulders, both of them grinning like the world couldn't touch them. She traced Jack's face with one finger. 20 years. 20 years since that knock on the door. Since the folded flag. Since the last letter that said Staff Sergeant Carter had carried him through hell and back. And now, that same man was sitting in her courtroom, looking like life had chewed him up and spit him out. A quiet knock made her jump. Alexander Ross stepped in, his expensive shoes quiet on the carpet. Olivia? He only used her first name when no one else could hear. What the hell's going on out there? She turned the photo toward him. That's him, Alex, the Marine who saved Jack in Fallujah. Ross took the picture, his eyebrows climbing. The homeless guy? You're sure? I'd know that name anywhere. Jack wrote about him every letter after that ambush. Her voice cracked. They told me he disappeared after his discharge. No forwarding address, no nothing. Ross set the photo down gently. Well, I found your guy. Or rather, he found you. He pulled out his phone. I made some calls while you were on the bench. Carter's been in and out of shelters for years. PTSD, traumatic brain injury, the whole 9 yards. Wife left him while he was deployed. Benefits got tied up in paperwork. Olivia's stomach twisted. And now he's sleeping behind a diner? Jimmy's Cafe. Yeah, owner's been calling the cops on him. Ross rubbed his temple. Look, you know I'll handle the legal side, but you can't be the one judging this case. The words hung between them. She knew he was right, knew the ethics rules backward and forward. But the image of Elias Carter's hollow eyes wouldn't leave her. I'm not recusing myself, she said finally. Olivia, that man carried my brother through gunfire. She stood straighter. The system failed him. I won't do it again. Ross sighed, but nodded. All right, then let's get him what he's owed. He headed for the door, then paused. You realize he has no idea who you are, right? You kept Tom's last name after the divorce. Olivia glanced at the photo again. Jack's smile seemed to say, do right by him, sis. Then, it's time he found out. Back in the courtroom, Elias sat perfectly still, like he'd spent a lifetime waiting in hard chairs. The cuffs weighed heavy on his wrists, but not as heavy as the memories. Fallujah. The smell of burning rubber. Jack Parker's blood on his hands as he dragged him to cover. The lawyer, Ross, slid into the seat beside him. We've got a plan, he murmured. Elias didn't look at him. Ain't no plan gonna fix this. Ross leaned closer. You'd be surprised. That judge, she's... The bailiff's voice cut him off. All rise. As Olivia Parker took the bench, Elias finally lifted his head. Something in her eyes made his breath catch. Not pity, something deeper, like she was seeing straight through him to the man he used to be. Mr. Carter, she said, and her voice carried across the silent courtroom. We're going to set things right. For the first time in years, Elias let himself hope. The moment the chamber door clicked shut, Olivia Parker's shoulders slumped, like a marionette with its strings cut. She pressed both palms flat against her desk, the polished wood cool beneath her fingers, and tried to steady her breathing. 20 years on the bench had taught her how to keep a poker face, but nothing could have prepared her for this. She reached into her robe pocket and pulled out the folded photograph she'd been carrying since Jack's funeral. The edges were soft from years of handling. The colors faded to sepia tones. There they were, her in her college graduation gown, Jack beaming in his dress blues, their parents flanking them with proud smiles. The last photo they'd all taken together before his deployment. A quiet knock at the door made her jump. Alexander Ross slipped inside, his usual confident stride replaced by something more hesitant. You okay? He asked, shutting the door behind him. Olivia shook her head, unable to form words. She handed him the photograph, pointing to the lanky Marine standing slightly behind Jack in the frame. That's him, she whispered. That's Elias Carter, Jack's sergeant. Ross studied the photo, his brow furrowing. Jesus, he murmured. He looks like a different person, Olivia finished. The man in the photo stood tall, his clean-shaven face open and alert, eyes bright with purpose. A far cry from the broken-down veteran in her courtroom. Ross sank into the chair across from her. I pulled his service record during recess. 2 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, honorable discharge after 20 years. Then, nothing. He rubbed his temples. VA lost track of him in 2008. Homeless shelters, occasional ER visits for frostbite. No permanent address in nearly a decade. The numbers should have been just statistics, but Olivia felt each one like a... Ross leaned forward. Olivia, you know I have to say this. You can't preside over this case. The conflict of interest. I don't care. The words came out sharper than she intended. She took a steadying breath. Alex, that man out there? He didn't just save Jack. He gave us 2 more weeks with him. 2 weeks of phone calls and letters. Time to say, her voice broke. Time to say goodbye properly. A heavy silence settled between them. Outside, the muffled sounds of the courthouse continued. Footsteps, distant voices, the occasional ringing phone. Normal life moving on, while hers had just tilted on its axis. Ross exhaled slowly. All right, then here's what we're gonna do. He pulled out his phone. I've got a buddy at Veterans Affairs. Let me make some calls. As Ross stepped into the hallway, Olivia turned back to the photograph. She traced Jack's face with her finger, remembering how he described Carter in his letters. The bravest man I ever knew, he'd were. The kind of Marine who makes you want to be better. The intercom buzzed. Judge Parker? The bailiff's voice came through. They're ready in courtroom 4. Olivia squared her shoulders, tucking the photo back into her pocket where it rested against her heart. Tell them I'll be right there. She took one last steadying breath before opening the door. Out in the hallway, through the small window set in the courtroom door, she could see Elias Carter sitting perfectly still at the defense table, his cuffed hands resting quietly in his lap. Waiting. Always waiting. Olivia pressed her hand against the door. This time, she whispered, more to Jack than to herself. We leave no one behind. The courtroom air hung thick as summer humidity as Olivia Parker settled back onto the bench. Every eye in the room tracked her movements. The bored jurors straightening in their seats, the prosecutor shuffling papers with nervous fingers, the spectators leaning forward like they could smell something big coming. But Olivia only had eyes for one man. Elias Carter sat with his shoulders squared in that particular way Marines never quite forgot, even when their bodies betrayed them. His cuffed hands rested quietly on the table, the veins standing out like old rope against his weathered skin. Mr. Carter, Olivia began, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. Before we proceed, I have some questions about your military service. The prosecutor's head jerked up. Your Honor, with all due respect. She silenced him with a look. This court recognizes that a man's character is relevant to sentencing, and I intend to understand the full character of the defendant. Elias's brow furrowed, but he gave a small nod. Olivia opened the file in front of her, though she didn't need to read it. She'd memorized every word during recess. Your records indicate you served in Fallujah in 2004 with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. A muscle in Elias's jaw twitched. Yes, ma'am. April 17th, 2004. Were you part of an operation near the western edge of the city? The change came over him slowly. His breathing deepened. His fingers curled slightly against the table. Olivia could practically see the years peeling away as the memory took hold. Yes, ma'am, he said softly. Supply convoy escort, got ambushed about 1400 hours. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Olivia pressed on. During that engagement, did you rescue a wounded officer? Lieutenant Jack Parker? The name landed like a grenade in the quiet room. Elias's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers for the first time. Something flickered in their depths. Recognition, confusion, pain. Parker, he repeated, the name rough in his throat. Young lieutenant, took a round trying to drag his medic to cover. His voice dropped to a near whisper. Kept telling me to leave him, save the others instead. In the gallery, a silver-haired man in a Marine Corps League jacket suddenly stood. That's him! His voice cracked with emotion. That's Staff Sergeant Carter. He saved 6 of us that day. The bailiff moved to restore order, but Olivia stayed him with a raised hand. Her eyes never left Elias. And what became of Lieutenant Parker? She asked, though she knew the answer better than anyone. Elias's throat worked. Got him on the medevac. Heard he made it to Germany. A long pause. 2 weeks later, his convoy hit an IED. His voice broke on the last word. Sometimes I wonder if saving him just delayed the inevitable. The raw grief in those words nearly undid Olivia. She gripped the edge of the bench to steady herself. The silver-haired Marine spoke again, louder this time. "Your Honor, I was there. Carter took 2 rounds pulling us out. Never complained, never asked for recognition." The prosecutor stood, flustered. "Your Honor, while Mr. Carter's service is commendable, it hardly excuses." "It explains," Olivia cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. "And this court will hear it." She brought the gavel down with more force than necessary. 10-minute recess. Mr. Carter remains here. As she stood to leave, Olivia allowed herself one last look at the broken hero before her. "When I return," she said quietly, "we're going to talk about more than this case." The promise hung in the air between them, heavy, hopeful, and 20 years overdue. The courtroom doors burst open with a sound like a rifle crack, making half the spectators jump in their seats. 3 Marines marched in, their dress blue so crisp they could have stood on their own. The one in front, a full-bird colonel with a chest full of ribbons, moved with the kind of authority that made the bailiff step back without thinking. Elias's body reacted before his mind caught up. His spine straightened, shoulders pulling back like he was 25 again, standing inspection. The cuffs bit into his wrists as his hands instinctively tried to come to attention. The colonel stopped at the defense table, looking Elias up and down with eyes that missed nothing. "Staff Sergeant Elias Carter?" His voice carried across the silent courtroom. Elias swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." The colonel turned to the bench. "Your Honor, Colonel James Matthews, United States Marine Corps. I apologize for the interruption, but we have urgent business with this man." Olivia nodded, like she'd been expecting this. "Proceed, Colonel." The youngest Marine, a corporal who couldn't have been more than 20, stepped forward carrying a polished wooden case. The colonel took it, his hands steady as he faced Elias again. "By order of the Secretary of the Navy," the colonel announced, his voice ringing off the courtroom walls. "And in recognition of extraordinary heroism, on April 17th, 2004, near Fallujah, Iraq." He opened the case. Nestled in blue velvet sat a medal that made the gallery gasp. "The Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Elias J. Carter, United States Marine Corps." Elias's knees nearly gave out. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. His vision blurred as he stared at the medal, the blue and white ribbon so vivid against the dark velvet. "There must be some mistake," he whispered. "No mistake, Sergeant," the colonel said firmly. "New evidence came to light about that ambush. Your actions didn't just save Lieutenant Parker's unit. You disrupted an attack that could have wiped out the entire battalion." He gestured to the silver-haired Marine in the gallery. "Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell here gave eyewitness testimony we didn't have before." The older Marine stood, tears cutting through the wrinkles on his face. "You told us to fall back while you covered our 6, he called out. "Took 2 rounds doing it. Never even reported your own wounds." From somewhere in the back, a voice barked, "Attention on deck!" The sound of chairs scraping filled the courtroom as every veteran stood at rigid attention. Civilians rose too, some placing hands over hearts. Even the prosecutor got to his feet, his face pale. Elias stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him harder than any pack march ever had. 20 years. 20 years of sleeping under bridges, of counting himself lucky when the shelters had space, of pretending the past didn't exist. And now here it was, staring him in the face with shiny medals and pressed uniforms. Olivia's voice cut through the silence. "In light of these extraordinary developments, all charges against Staff Sergeant Elias Carter are dismissed, permanently." Her gavel came down with finality. This court is adjourned. But no one moved. The colonel stepped forward, removing Elias's cuffs with a set of keys from the bailiff. The metal clicked open, falling away like the last chain holding him to his old life. "Welcome home, Sergeant," the colonel said quietly, pressing the metal case into Elias's shaking hands. For the first time in years, Elias Carter stood tall, not because he had to, but because the courtroom buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. But Elias Carter didn't hear any of it. His whole world had narrowed down to the weight of that wooden case in his hands. The Navy Cross gleamed up at him, so polished it hurt to look at. His fingers trembled against the velvet lining, the same fingers that had once steadied rifles and dragged wounded men to safety. Master Sergeant Ruiz, the young one with the sharp creases in his uniform, stepped forward with a tablet. "Sir," he said, and just hearing that word after so many years of being nobody nearly broke Elias all over again. "We've been trying to locate you to update your VA records." He swiped the screen. "Your disability rating's been reassessed, 100% service-connected, retroactive to your discharge date." Elias blinked. "What's that mean exactly?" Ruiz's mouth quirked in something close to a smile. "Means back pay, sir. Full medical, housing allowance, whatever you need." Alexander Ross materialized at Elias's elbow, his lawyer voice back in full force. "My firm will handle every last form. No more red tape, no more delays." His grip was firm when he shook Elias's hand. "Consider it a debt repaid." From the back of the courtroom, a commotion broke out. Jimmy, the cafe cook who'd left sandwiches by the dumpster, was pushing through the crowd, his apron still splattered with grease. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands shaking worse than Elias's. "My dad," Jimmy started, then had to stop and swallow hard. "My dad used to tell me about this Marine who saved his whole platoon in Iraq. Said if I ever met Elias Carter, I owed him everything." A tear cut through the flour dust on his cheek. "I've been feeding you grilled cheeses for 6 months and never knew you were him." Elias's throat closed up. He remembered Jimmy's dad, a skinny kid from Pittsburgh who'd screamed for a corpsman when shrapnel tore up his leg. Remembered promising the kid he'd make it home. And now here was his boy, all grown up, still keeping promises his daddy couldn't. The prosecutor, the slick young guy who'd been so eager to lock him up, shuffled forward, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Sir," he muttered, staring at his shiny shoes, "I had no idea. I'm sorry." Elias surprised himself by clapping the kid on the shoulder. "You were doing your job." The words came out rough, but kind. He'd seen enough young officers fresh out of Quantico to recognize when someone was just following orders. Judge Parker, no, Olivia, she'd asked him to call her Olivia, descended from the bench. Without the black robe, she looked smaller somehow, more human. The crowd parted for her, like the Red Sea. She stopped an arm's length away, close enough that Elias could see the ghost of her brother in the set of her jaw. "Jack wrote about what you said to him that day," she said softly, "just for him. No Marine gets left behind, not while I'm still breathing." Her hand brushed the metal case. "Today, Sergeant Carter, we finally kept that promise to you." Elias looked around at the sea of faces, Marines young and old. Jimmy wiping his eyes on his sleeve. Even the bailiff nodding respectfully. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel invisible. He squared his shoulders, the weight of the metal in his hands feeling right somehow, like picking up a pack after too long at rest. Not a burden, a purpose. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice didn't shake at all. "Permission to carry on." Olivia Parker smiled, and for a second he could have sworn Jack was standing right beside her. "Granted, Sergeant. Welcome home. 2 weeks later, Elias stood in front of the bathroom mirror, running a razor over cheeks that hadn't seen a proper shave in years. The apartment was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards settling. He still wasn't used to the silence. After so many nights listening to the wind howl through alleyways, the steady warmth of four walls felt almost unnatural. He patted his face dry and studied his reflection. The man staring back still had the same tired eyes, the same deep lines carved by too many desert suns and frozen winters. But something had shifted. The hollowness beneath his cheekbones wasn't quite so pronounced. He looked presentable, like somebody who belonged in the world again. The medals hanging on the wall caught the morning light as he walked into the living room. The Navy Cross took center stage, flanked by his Purple Hearts and the other ribbons Ross had tracked down from some pawn shop in Virginia. Elias touched the edge of the frame, still half convinced this was all some elaborate dream. A knock at the door startled him. Through the peephole, he saw Olivia Parker standing in the hallway, holding a small wooden box. Not Judge Parker today, just Olivia, wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair down around her shoulders. He opened the door. "Ma'am." "Just Olivia," she reminded him with a smile. "May I come in?" The apartment wasn't much. A couch, a coffee table, a tiny kitchenette. But it was clean, and it was his. Olivia sat on the edge of the sofa, placing the box between them, like it contained something fragile. "I brought you something," she said, lifting the lid. Inside lay a stack of letters, their edges worn soft from handling, all tied together with faded ribbon. "Jack's letters home. I thought you might want to read them." Elias's hands hovered over the bundle, afraid to touch. The top envelope was dated April 18th, 2004, the day after the ambush. His breath hitched as he unfolded the paper. Jack's handwriting leapt off the page, bold and slanted, like the man himself. "Mom, Dad, Liv, don't worry about what you're seeing on the news. I'm okay thanks to one of our NCOs, Staff Sergeant Carter. Yesterday, he did something I still can't believe." Elias had to stop reading. The words blurred in front of him. He could almost hear Jack's voice, that mix of Boston accent and officer school polish. Olivia's hand covered his. "He wrote about you often, said you were the Marine he wanted to be." Elias shook his head. "I was just doing my job. That's what all the good ones say." She squeezed his fingers before letting go. "After Jack died, I went to law school because of him, because of what he wrote about how we treat our vets." She gestured around the apartment. "This housing program, it exists because of my brother." The weight of that settled over Elias like a blanket. All these years, he'd thought no one remembered, thought his service had faded into the desert sand along with so many others. But here was proof. In Jack's words, in Olivia's eyes, in the roof over his head, that it had mattered. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the city in quiet white. For the first time in 20 years, Elias Carter was warm. "Thank you," he said. And it wasn't just for the letters. It was for remembering, for seeing him when the rest of the world had looked away. Olivia smiled, and in that moment, he could see her brother looking back at him. "Welcome home, Sergeant."